Welcome to the KuppingerCole Analyst Chat. I'm your host. My name is Matthias Reinwarth. I'm an analyst and advisor at KuppingerCole Analysts. And like in every edition, we have in this edition one guest joining me, a fellow analyst, and we will have 15 minutes or so to chat around a special topic. My guest today is Alexei Balaganski. He's a lead analyst for KuppingerCole in Duisburg, Germany. Welcome, Alexei.
Oh, hello, Matthias. Thanks for having me again.
Great to have you. So today we will talk about a topic that you suggested and that has the impressive title, The Dark Side of the API Economy. And that sounds interesting. That sounds challenging. But to start with, can you give us a quick introduction into the terminology? What is an API anyway?
Well, I guess that's really the best question, because so many people have this very old school perception that an API is something that only IT should be thinking about. So API is an acronym which means Application Programming Interface. And again, it sounds very technical and IT-ish, if you will. But the point is that while 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was indeed like that, but nowadays APIs are not just everywhere. They are also powering everything around us. They are one of the major drivers of the whole digital transformation. Because to think of it, the very term we analysts like so much, the digital transformation. Many people still think that whenever they migrate from paper-based documentation to Word and Excel, they have already undergone the transformation. That's not true. Kind of a company really becomes digitalized, digitally transformed, if you will, only when this digital information becomes the very essence of its processes and sometimes even its major product and source of revenue. And this is exactly what happened to so many companies already. Large cloud service providers, companies like Google, Facebook, and other huge technical giants, their product is digital information and their logistics are the APIs. So basically APIs are the glue that enable digitally transformed businesses work together.
So these APIs represent digital services. So this is really something that you can use from your own application/business model and leverage then functionality services that others provide via an API.
Well, I mean, obviously, services, digital services have existed for decades already. So as long as we have networks, we already had some different service-based architectures like CORBA, DCOM in early Windows ages, SOAP and XML RPC in the kind of enterprise Unix world. It was like 30 years ago, 20 years ago. Nowadays, when we are talking about APIs, we are talking about specifically RESTful APIs, which are extremely simple, lightweight, based on the standard HTTP protocol, which powers all the World Wide Web. And yes, indeed, it's a standard. It's an architectural pattern which has an extremely low learning curve, so everyone can start publishing their existing services as RESTful APIs in minutes, really, maybe hours. And of course, they can start consuming someone else's APIs in minutes or hours. And while it's so easy to dive into, this is exactly what has led to this proverbial API explosion. Because what just maybe 15 years ago was a purely technical term used by a handful of IT nerds or developers, now it's APIs everywhere. And RESTful APIs are basically the backbone of the modern internet.
So now that we learned what an API is or what APIs are, because there are obviously lots around, what then actually is meant with the term API economy?
Well, to be honest, I find this term a little bit deceptive because you do not earn money with APIs. You earn money with your core digital competence. It might be a source of valuable information. It might be some kind of an online service, for example. Just as the simplest example would be online weather forecast. If you want to know the current weather, you no longer have to look out of your window. You can just open the website if you are a human, but if you are a device, if you are someone else's mobile phone, basically you need to call an API. And of course, this API call might be not necessarily free. You can subscribe to an API, which is kind of monetized, and every time you call it, you have to pay a little bit, just a few cents. But if you call an API millions or billions times monthly, the revenue can skyrocket. Well, look at Google. I would say that APIs are probably like a majority of their income.
Right. So that requires also, when you subscribe to such an API, that you authenticate, that you show the service provider who you are and that you are a legitimate user of this service, and that you most probably also will pay the bill afterwards. So there's security built in there.
Exactly. And this is exactly where kind of the second most prevalent myth about APIs is that if APIs, the RESTful APIs, are so easy to implement, then surely it should be just as easy to implement them properly, if you will. Unfortunately, kind of implementing an API properly, meaning an API which is resilient to denial of service attacks, which is always available, which is secure and cannot be exploited by malicious actors, and so on and so forth, it's actually extremely difficult. So yeah, I mean, you can probably learn to play piano with one finger in an hour, but if you want to play something really well, you have to spend years. And exactly the same applies to API security, if you will, because API security is such a complicated field that we could probably talk hours about this question alone, but we only have 15 minutes, so let's talk about practical implications.
Okay, and if we talk about practical implications, of course, as we all have been using computer systems for quite some time, we know what can go wrong. So a function call, which is behind an API, might be not well implemented, or the security layer in front of that is not well implemented. So there is a way around the actual authentication process. Or if things just break down during processing, maybe some information still is left and returned via the API. But if we think of API security from the negative point of view, and you said there is a dark side of the API economy, what has already gone wrong?
Well, to be honest, everything which could have gone wrong has already gone wrong so many times that it's just almost ridiculous to see. I've been following this topic for quite a few years. I think I started at least 5 or 6 years ago, when it was really kind of very narrow and almost considered irrelevant for businesses. And even back then, it was obvious that traditional security tools are not good enough dealing with API threats. Even though APIs are basically running on the same HTTP protocol as your quote-unquote normal websites. And to think of it, modern websites are basically like 90% API based already. A traditional web security tool like a web application firewall cannot catch all the potential API related threats. And in fact, that's basically one of the topics which we've been pushing for years and years. And I think only last year, the API security has finally become noticeable among the general public and quote unquote general security experts. Probably because of the series of really high profile and hugely massive data breaches, which were affecting companies like Facebook and Instagram and United States Postal Service, and really huge companies which supposedly have hundreds, if not thousands, of security experts tasked to protect their interfaces. And they failed miserably because they were simply kind of overlooking not immediately obvious API-related attack vectors. And speaking of those API-related attack vectors, again, we could probably talk hours about all the possible combinations of attacks. I think in one of our earlier webinars, we have covered at least 25 of them. But what I really like is that finally last year, the very well-known OWASP, Open Web Application Security Project organization, they have finally come up with the API security top 10 threats. So finally, there is a reputable and widely recognized security-related company which said, yes, you should have this top 10 API security threats in mind. And they are really interesting because they cover various aspects of cybersecurity, ranging from, as you mentioned earlier, authentication and authorization, both on user level and on object level. They cover kind of infrastructure level threats like lack of rate limiting and security misconfigurations. They cover quote unquote traditional web related threats like SQL injections. But again, this is just only 2 of 10. And of course, they are focusing on compliance related things like excessive data exposure. For example, when an improperly coded API call invoked with a intentionally broken set of parameters, for example, returns you information from your whole user database instead of just one user. And this is exactly what happened with US Postal Service a couple of years ago, where they managed to leak tens of millions of their customer sensitive data within weeks, basically.
Okay, so we can assume that attackers are out there that are just looking for APIs, for not well-secured APIs, who do that maybe even automatically, so that they are really trying to find these APIs that are not well-designed?
Absolutely. And by the way, here you are raising probably the most important API security-related problem. The attackers out there, they are doing this spraying attacks, basically, and they are targeting your whole network, and they're able to discover APIs and then exploit them. And those will be APIs which you yourself have absolutely no idea about. This is probably still the biggest problem for many companies. They simply do not know how many different APIs they have in their networks, in their infrastructures. And it doesn't have to be your own API, like the one that exposes your own business logic. It can be a third-party API, it can be a management API for a smart device, like a printer or a web camera. It can be anything. And you've probably heard about a really amusing data breach in one of the, I think it was a casino somewhere in the United States, which was hacked through a smart pump for a fish tank, which was displayed in the hall. So an unsecured API for a smart pump for a fish tank in your casino's main hall was enough to rob that casino of a substantial amount of money. Just think of it, the potential implications of improperly configured API security.
But usually it will be one developer who designs an API for themselves or just as a helper API, and that is not well protected, and that can put a complete organization at risk. So this also needs to be identified. Are there tools to really find these not well documented APIs? If the attackers can find it, maybe the ones who want to protect the organization might also be able to find that.
Absolutely, and again, I just said I've been following this API security market for quite a number of years already, and I was totally frustrated seeing that there are so few companies who actually position themselves as API security vendors. Because until probably a couple of years ago, every company in that market was an API management vendor. So basically, they were thinking about how to publish your API as quickly as possible and how to start monetizing it, which is great, which is what powers the API economy. But again, kind of security has always been overlooked. And only in the recently published leadership compass on API security, which I did last year, and which you can find on our website, by the way, I am happy to say that there is really a market segment for API security tools, finally. So if the year 2017 was proclaimed the year of API economy by the reputable Forbes magazine, then I would say the year of 2019 was finally the year of API security. And again, there is the selection of these tools is extremely varied. There are some solutions which only focus on reactive security, if you will. So basically, they will detect if something bad is happening to your API, and they'll alert you and let you investigate and fix it, which is how most other traditional security tools nowadays are functioning. But of course, there are some companies which focus on proactive security. They would say, before you even start writing your code, in the very early stage of API design, when you create your so-called Open API specification, or Swagger, as it was previously known, when you only define which methods and properties your API is exposing, you should already start thinking about security. And they will help you create your API, design your API structure in a way that it's as resilient to attacks as possible. And it's really nice to see that such developments are already ongoing, and we will see more of those proactive API security solutions this year and next year, of course.
Okay, so this is really also the approach of security by design, building the security into the API or not adding it afterwards as an afterthought, and usually missing out one important fact.
Exactly.
Okay, so that now that we've come almost to the end of this podcast, if you could provide a few key takeaways for the audience out there, which just had some bad feelings about the APIs they might expose, what would you recommend to them?
Well, obviously, the first and foremost recommendation would be stop thinking that API security is easy. It's not. It's extremely complicated, and it really requires a very well thought out strategic approach and careful planning. And of course, to understand all the potential threat vectors, you have to educate yourself, and you have to educate your other stakeholders, especially the developers, the actual people responsible for creating your APIs. And of course, just like with any other field of cybersecurity, visibility is the key. You have to know all your APIs, not your own, but also the third-party APIs, as I mentioned, the management APIs, the hardware APIs, anything. You have to discover them. You have to understand the potential risks. So basically, you have to do some kind of threat modeling and risk assessment and classification based on those criteria. And you have to constantly monitor an API. Because as the real-life example with, for example, Instagram hack indicated, even a very well-designed and very well-protected API, through a simple human mistake, can go unprotected for a short period of time. That's exactly what happened with Instagram. A developer accidentally published a wrong version of API, which was not properly authenticated. And so that small window of time, the hackers who managed to identify this opportunity immediately were able to hijack hundreds of high-profile accounts from celebrities and bankers and actors and so on. You don't want this to happen to you, because any company smaller than Facebook cannot really bear that reputational damage and survive.
Okay, got it. So thank you very much, Alexei, for that. So of course, if some of the audience are really interested in learning more about that, they of course are recommended to read the Leadership Compass that you just mentioned about the API security products out there, and to follow us on our website and you on our website when it comes to further developments here. And of course, if they want to get in touch with us or with you, please feel free to just contact us at KuppingerCole.com or just drop us a mail. So thank you very much, Alexei, again. I think this is a topic that deserves more than just one 15 minutes podcast or 20 minutes podcast. I will be happy to invite you for that topic again and to dig a bit deeper into what's really going on there in the gory details. Anything else you want to add?
Well, first of all, thank you, Matthias, for inviting me again. I hope to return to this podcast in the future and discuss this and other topics as well. And thank you for all the current and future listeners of this podcast for being with us. And again, I would like to emphasize that we are going to discuss, like today and in the future, hopefully, topics which are not as hyped and buzzword worthy as like blockchain or AI, cybersecurity, and so on. But they are in no way less relevant or less dangerous to overlook. So API security is crucial for almost every company, because APIs should be really considered a part of critical infrastructure nowadays.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thanks again. Thanks for listening. And I'm looking forward to having you all in one future edition of this podcast again. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Goodbye.